to be examining the question, how did the Korean conflict change the terms of the containment doctrine? So if you recall, containment is the idea that the United States was going to be dedicated to preventing the spread of communism. They weren't going to fight it outright. They would just said, we're just going to try to contain it where it exists today. And that takes us to this Korean conflict. And so I had asked you to identify some of the causes of the Korean conflict. So let's start there, that the U.S. wanted to contain communism. And Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel after World War II. And then North Korea attacked the South. North Korea that was communist, we need to mention that, of course. And the United States felt like we needed to get involved and help, but of course we didn't act alone. We acted with the UN here. So there was a vote held in the UN, and the Soviets would have vetoed involvement in this conflict had they been present at the vote. But it just turned out that the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN because of its refusal to recognize communist China, which had just happened in 1949. And this is happening in 1951. So let's write that up here. 1951 to 53. Okay, and so let's add that in, that the UN voted to get involved, but the Soviet Union wasn't present to veto this action because they were boycotting. Due to its refusal to recognize communist China. And that took place in 1949, so let's put that in. Okay, and so we see the United States acting with the UN to send forces to contain the North and to remove the North from South Korea. And this can be compared to a future conflict where we see the United States acting with the UN in the Persian Gulf War in 1991 because the United States didn't act alone there. And we saw an aggressive country of Iraq attack its neighbor Kuwait. And the United States acted with the UN to contain that aggression. And so it's really a parallel experience. Okay, so these are the causes of the Korean conflict. And notice that I'm referring to it as a conflict and not a war. I'm doing that intentionally because war was never declared by Congress. This was completely a move by the president with the UN. So that's something that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, and so let's go down to that political cartoon on the next page for a second before we get to the effects. I really like this cartoon because you see Harry Truman here represented by his bow tie and glasses, so you know that's Harry Truman, and he's dragging the UN um, that is carrying a weapon in her hand, and they're going over someplace, and as they're going to someplace new, which we know they're going to Korea, they're passing over the grave of the League of Nations. And so I don't know if you can read this in your copy, but it says died of lack of exercise facing wanton aggression. And so, you know, this is a little commentary on the fact that the League of Nations did nothing during the build-up, or did very little during the build-up to World War II. And now we have this new international organization that has weapons capability, and that the President of the United States was not going to sit by and allow an aggressor nation to get away with attacking his neighbor, or its neighbor, I should say. So let's just kind of answer question 3 while we're down here. Okay. So now let's move back up to our effects. All right, this is a map that I really like because it kind of demonstrates the history of the Korean conflict, where we see North Korea attacking the South, and they're really quite successful in their attack. And then the United States and the UN get involved, and they launch an attack, and they were able to push the northern troops back up all the way almost to the border of China. And at this point, we see this conflict between Truman and MacArthur about, you know, how far should we take this conflict? Are we going to focus on just simply containment, or are we going to escalate this and go into China? And you know from your reading that MacArthur was willing to attack China, maybe even use nuclear weapons, and Truman said, no, we can't do that. And he wound up firing MacArthur for that, because MacArthur kind of went behind Truman's back, and he spoke to members of Congress and the media, trying to push his plan to the public, to get the public and the members of Congress on his side. So Truman wound up firing him because Truman really didn't want this to escalate into a potential Third World War. So he had other factors to consider, factors that MacArthur wasn't really thinking about. Okay, and so now we see the North fighting back, and then in the end, the armistice line, or the demilitarized zone, at the 38th parallel. And so pretty much they wound up exactly where they started, and so this whole thing was really kind of pointless. And so let's go back to our effects box, and we'll talk about that. We see that the containment policy was only partially successful. Because we managed to contain North Korea, but we didn't get rid of North Korea's communism. And they drew an armistice, which is a ceasefire at the 38th parallel, which still is the dividing line today. And this certainly increased global tensions. And to this day, North Korea is a communist nation, and it faces sanctions for doing that. And we see a lot of nations are not trading with North Korea, and it's a very, very bad situation in North Korea. The people have very few rights. They have limited access to information. And I know you guys learned about that last year in Global. But there's a really good book on this. This is a semi-fictional account called Escape from Camp 14. I'm just going to write down the title here, Escape from Camp 14. And it's supposed to be a memoir. Look, I misspelled that. It's supposed to be a memoir, but some of the facts didn't check out. But it's a really good story, and it's mostly true about this man who was born inside a North Korean prison camp, and he managed to escape. So that's something, if you're interested in this topic, I would highly recommend, especially since you have all this time to do it. You could download the Kindle app on your phone and buy that book. Okay, just a suggestion. All right, so we kind of answered this already, but let's fill this in. That the war resolved nothing. Okay, we talked about this. Oh, I wanted to talk about this question. What would the senators who rejected the Treaty of Versailles say about this action, about the United States getting involved? They would say this is exactly what we did not want. We see the president getting involved in foreign conflict without congressional declaration of war. And let's fix that. And it shows an expansion of presidential power that could potentially be dangerous. And then, from this point on, we see this becoming the norm, that presidents can send troops in, and we see this in Vietnam, we see it in Iraq, we see it in Afghanistan, because Congress took some action, but it wasn't an official declaration of war. So this is really something that kind of set the groundwork for an expansion of presidential power. Okay, this cartoon discusses the dispute between MacArthur and Truman, which we kind of talked about a little bit, so I'm just going to write down our answer here, that MacArthur was being disrespectful of Truman's plans, towards Truman's plans. Truman wanted to keep the conflict limited. Because it could possibly start a third world war. MacArthur wanted to win by attacking China, even using nuclear weapons if necessary. So this is certainly a problem. And the thing is that MacArthur was a really popular war hero from World War II, and he was very well known with the public, and that's why this is public opinion here. And we see that Truman is kind of getting to be in a bad spot here because the public would have been annoyed about the firing, but he felt it was necessary to do to preserve civilian control of the military. Okay, and I wanted to explain this term because it does come up, at least on the Regents exam. They do ask about this, that the president's commander in chief. He's elected by the people. And if he's going to be, he needs to be in charge of the military because if anyone is going in to fight, he's going to be risking American lives, and the American public should have say over that, not just a general, a military general. Okay, and just as a side note that doesn't have anything to do with this particular question, during the Korean War, President Truman desegregated the armed forces. Conflict, Truman desegregated. So we'll be discussing the civil rights movement soon. And so this is a step in the civil rights movement. Okay, so now let's go back to our aim. How did the Korean conflict change the terms of the containment doctrine? Well, up to this point in history, we see the containment doctrine including the Truman Doctrine, sending military aid and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. We saw the Marshall Plan, where we were going to send money to Western Europe to help rebuild it. We see the Berlin airlift, where we sent in supplies to West Berlin to prevent its takeover by the East. But we never sent troops anyplace. But this Korean conflict now means that the United States is willing to send troops into conflict to fight communism. Okay, so that's a shift in containment. And that's the end of today's lesson. Thank you very much. Have a great day.